My name is Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. Today, I do not speak to you to display power. I speak to share something that comes from conscience. I send these words to my Christian brothers and sisters, to the leaders of the Sahel region, and to people across the world who still believe that leadership must answer to a value higher than itself. I also speak to those who believe in Jesus not only as a religious figure, but as a moral voice that dares to question the powerful and comfort those who suffer. I did not prepare this message. It came to me after many days of exhaustion, long nights of continuous meetings, reports of violence, cold numbers of the dead, those forced to leave their homes, people forgotten by the world. When the body is tired, the mind is not quiet. It becomes heavier. Thoughts return again and again. Questions no longer have answers. That night, I sat down only to rest for a moment. I did not intend to sleep. What happened was not deep sleep, but a fragile state between alertness and surrender. There, the world does not disappear, but it seems to loosen its grip on me. In that state, I did not think about politics or strategy. I thought about responsibility. I asked myself, does power, even when first held with good intentions, gradually teach a person how to compromise? I also asked myself, when silence is easier than speaking the truth, does that silence become a form of complicity? That is where the story begins. And now, I will tell you what I saw. In that fragile state between waking and sleep, the world returned to me in images rather than thoughts. I found myself standing on land that felt endlessly wide, yet exhausted. The ground was cracked, dry, and scarred, as if it had been wounded many times and never allowed to heal. The wind carried red dust that clung to my skin and filled my lungs. It was the dust of Africa, familiar and painful at once. In the distance, I saw houses collapsed into themselves, not from age but from violence. Smoke rose without flames. The sound of children crying did not come from one place but from everywhere. Beneath it all, there was the distant echo of gunfire, not loud, not dramatic, but constant, like a sickness that refuses to leave the body. I recognized this land. It was not one country, it was many. It was the Sahel. It was Africa, as she is too often seen by her own sons when hope is stretched thin. I felt small there, not as a president, not as a soldier, but as a man standing amid consequences that no single person can undo. Then the air changed. There was no thunder, no command, no fear. A light appeared, gentle and steady, not blinding, not theatrical. It did not push the darkness away, it simply stood within it, and from that light, Jesus appeared. He did not look as paintings often show him. There was no gold, no crown, no distant perfection. He wore a simple white garment, worn at the edges, marked with dust. His feet were bare, touching the cracked earth, as if he had been walking among the people for a long time. His face held no anger, only a deep, quiet sorrow. He did not speak at first. He only looked at the land, and then at me. In that moment, I understood that this was not a dream meant to comfort me. It was one meant to confront me. The light did not move. Jesus did not raise his voice, yet everything around us seemed to listen. He lifted his hand, and without touching me, he showed me Africa as she truly is, not as she is described in reports or reduced to headlines. I saw fertile fields stretching farther than the eye could reach, soil rich enough to feed millions. And yet, beside those fields, I saw empty bowls and thin bodies, hunger standing next to abundance, like a quiet accusation. I saw hospitals with walls but no medicine, beds without sheets, doctors without tools. Disease did not appear as an enemy sent from heaven, but as a guest invited by neglect. It thrived where care had withdrawn. I saw cities divided by war, not because the people loved violence, but because hatred had been taught patiently, generation after generation. I saw leaders seated in grand halls, speaking of sovereignty while their people whispered of survival. Then Jesus spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried weight, not the weight of threat, but of truth that cannot be argued away. I did not create poverty, he said. I did not give birth to disease. I did not plant war in the hearts of men. These things grow when power walks ahead of love. I wanted to look away, not because I disagreed, but because I recognized myself in the question that followed. He turned his gaze toward me, not accusing, not forgiving, only honest. Do you think tyrants are born from evil? He asked. They are not. They are born from compromise. In that moment, I understood something that frightened me more than any battlefield. No leader begins by choosing cruelty. It begins with delay, with small silences, with justifications that sound reasonable, with the belief that one wrong step can be corrected later. He showed me the future not as prophecy carved in stone, but as consequence flowing from habits. I saw young leaders, once idealistic, telling themselves that corruption must be tolerated for stability. I saw men who once spoke of justice learning to speak only of security. I saw women and men convincing themselves that postponing truth was the same as protecting peace. Each decision sounded logical, each step felt necessary, and each one quietly moved them away from the people they had promised to serve. This is how conscience erodes, Jesus said, not through rebellion, but through agreement. I felt an inner conflict rise in me. A voice inside argued back, calmly, persuasively. What if exposure causes chaos? What if truth ignites violence? What if patience saves more lives than confrontation? These were not foolish thoughts. They were intelligent, practical, and deeply tempting. They were the kind of arguments that make surrender feel like wisdom. Jesus did not dismiss them. He acknowledged their danger. Evil survives, he said, not because it is strong, but because it is given time. He showed me leaders who believed they could control corruption by managing it, who thought they could ride injustice until the right moment to dismount. But the moment never came. The system grew stronger than their will. I realized then that the future he revealed was not inevitable. It was conditional. It depended on daily choices that never make headlines. He did not ask me to be perfect. He asked me to be awake. And in that awareness, I felt no pride, no reassurance, only responsibility. The scene shifted without violence. The land remained dry, the wind still carried dust, but the images narrowed, as if asking me to focus. Jesus spoke again, not with urgency, but with insistence that came from patience rather than force. Build a great house, he said. At first I misunderstood. I thought of monuments, of history carved in stone, of how often power hides itself behind sacred architecture. I felt resistance rise in me immediately. I am a man who has seen religion misused. I have watched faith turned into a shield for injustice and a ladder for ambition. I feared that such a building would divide more than unite. He sensed this before I spoke. Not a house to display religious power, he said. A house to remind. Then I understood. He showed me a place where people entered not to escape the world, but to remember it more clearly. A place where the poor were not made invisible by sermons, but named. Where dignity was spoken aloud so often that forgetting it became difficult. In this house, leaders would not sit above others. They would sit among them, not to confess publicly, but to listen privately. To remember that authority is borrowed, never owned. Jesus looked at me carefully. People do not live by bread alone, he said, but neither do they live by slogans. He showed me how hunger of the soul does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers through cynicism, through resignation, through the quiet belief that nothing will ever change. A house like this would not solve poverty, it would not end war, but it would resist numbness. I felt the temptation immediately. Would this not be misunderstood? Would it not be criticized as symbolic distraction? Would it not invite suspicion from those who fear any union of faith and state? These concerns were real, sensible, politically sound. But Jesus answered the fear beneath them. When leaders stop fearing misunderstanding, he said, they begin fearing their conscience again. I realized then that the danger was not building such a place. The danger was refusing to build reminders at all. Power does not collapse because it lacks strength. It collapses because it forgets why it exists. This first call was not about religion. It was about memory. And memory, I learned, is a form of resistance. The ground beneath us did not change, but the images did. The dust settled, the noise faded. What remained was quieter and somehow heavier. Jesus did not need to raise his hand this time. The vision unfolded on its own. I saw a hospital, or rather the idea of one. Walls stood, but they felt empty. Beds were lined up neatly, yet many were unused. Not because there were no patients, but because there were no medicines, no gloves, no electricity that stayed long enough to matter. I saw a mother sitting beside a child whose breathing was shallow. She was not crying. She had already passed that stage. Her eyes were fixed on the wall, as if hope itself had grown tired. Nearby, a nurse moved from bed to bed, not rushed but resigned, doing what she could, knowing it would never be enough. Jesus spoke softly. Build hospitals. I felt the words settle in my chest like a weight. I have heard this call before, many times, from economists, from humanitarian organizations, from doctors who return home broken by what they have seen. But this time, the words were not technical. They were personal. I did not create illness, he said. I did not design suffering as a lesson. Indifference did that. This disturbed me. Because indifference is not always cruelty. Often, it is exhaustion. It is bureaucracy. It is the slow drowning of compassion under procedures and budgets and waiting for the next fiscal year. He showed me how easily leaders speak of faith while ignoring the body, how prayers are offered for healing while clinics remain unfunded, how mercy becomes an idea instead of an action. Care for the body is not separate from belief, Jesus said. It is belief made visible. I felt an internal resistance rise again, familiar and dangerous. Resources are limited. Security comes first. We must prioritize stability before care. These arguments were not lies, they were strategies. They were the language of survival in fragile states. They were the words leaders use when they are forced to choose between tragedies. Jesus did not condemn the complexity, but he asked a question that stripped away comfort. When did survival replace responsibility, he asked. I thought of budgets debated line by line, of funds redirected for weapons because threats felt immediate, of hospitals postponed because corruption made every investment risky, of how easily delay becomes permanent. He showed me that abandoning the sick is rarely a decision, it is a habit. The sin is not in failing to save everyone, he said. The sin is in learning to accept who we let die. I understood then that mercy, if it remains abstract, becomes harmless, and harmless mercy changes nothing. This second call was not about infrastructure. It was about refusing to make peace with avoidable suffering. And I knew, painfully, that this refusal would cost more than money. It would demand confrontation with systems that benefit from neglect. This time, when Jesus spoke again, his voice carried a sorrow deeper than before. Not anger, not disappointment, something closer to grief. The vision changed. I saw offices instead of battlefields, desks instead of weapons, papers stamped and signed, doors closed softly, politely, no shouting, no blood, and yet the damage was everywhere. I saw contracts approved that should never have been signed. I saw envelopes passed quietly, hands never touching. I saw leaders convincing themselves that taking a little would allow them to give a lot later. I saw officials telling themselves that corruption was the price of keeping the system functioning. And I saw the people who paid for it, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, through roads never finished, through schools without teachers, through hospitals without supplies, through hope diluted until it tasted like nothing. Jesus looked at me, and his words were heavier than any accusation. Remove corrupt leaders, he said. I felt my body tense. This is where violence begins, I thought. This is where nations fracture. This is where blood is spilled in the name of purity. Before I could speak, he continued. Not with weapons, he said, with conscience. He showed me something I had not expected. Corruption, he revealed, does not survive because people love it. It survives because people fear exposure more than injustice, because silence feels safer than truth, because speaking costs friendships, careers, sometimes lives. He showed me how bribery grows in darkness, not because it is hidden, but because it is normalized. How entire systems adjust themselves to wrongdoing until honesty feels disruptive. The greatest threat to corruption, Jesus said, is not punishment, it is awakening. This frightened me more than force ever could, because awakening cannot be controlled. I felt the temptation rise again, dressed in reason. Expose too much, and chaos follows. Truth must be managed. Gradual reform is wiser than confrontation. These thoughts were familiar. They sounded responsible. They sounded like leadership. But Jesus challenged the logic beneath them. When truth is delayed, he said, it does not grow gentler, it grows heavier. He showed me leaders who believed they could cleanse systems quietly, who told themselves they would act tomorrow, who thought their intentions excused their inaction, and in time, they became defenders of the very structures they once opposed. This is how tyranny is born, he said softly, not from hatred, but from accommodation. I felt exposed, not accused, but seen. I realized that corruption is not only about stolen money, it is about stolen courage. About the moment when a leader decides that peace with injustice is preferable to conflict for justice. He did not ask me to overthrow governments, he asked me to refuse silence, to protect those who speak, to build systems where truth does not require heroism to survive. Evil does not fear guns, Jesus said. It fears conscience that refuses to sleep. This third call was the hardest, because it offered no dramatic victory, no clear end, only ongoing resistance. And I understood then that this war would never be won once and for all. It would have to be fought every day, in small decisions that no one applauds. After the third call, the visions did not end. They became quieter, more personal, less about nations, more about the man standing there. Jesus no longer showed me others, he showed me myself. Not as I appear in public, but as I am in private moments, when no microphones are open and no flags are raised. He showed me my own justifications. The careful words I use to explain delay, the moments when I choose what is manageable over what is right, The times I tell myself that restraint is wisdom when it is also fear. I wanted to speak of intention, of how much I want to serve, of how difficult the terrain is, of enemies, pressures, histories heavier than one lifetime. He did not reject any of this, but he asked something simpler and therefore more demanding. Who are you becoming while you wait, he asked. I understood then that moral failure is rarely a collapse. It is a drift, a series of reasonable choices that slowly train the heart to accept what it once resisted. He showed me that power does not corrupt by force. It seduces by offering relief, relief from constant struggle, relief from being misunderstood, relief from standing alone. I saw how easily leaders confuse endurance with virtue, how they learn to celebrate survival while neglecting purpose, how they begin to protect their position instead of the people who gave it meaning. This was not condemnation. It was invitation. Jesus did not tell me I had failed. He asked whether I was willing to continue choosing. I felt the weight of that word. Continue. Not decide once, not make a declaration, but wake up each day and choose again. Choose truth over convenience. Choose service over control. Choose conscience over applause. I saw clearly then that righteousness is not a destination. It is a discipline, one that must be practiced daily, especially when no one is watching. I spoke for the first time. I did not defend myself. I did not promise success. I admitted fear. I admitted uncertainty. I admitted that I will make mistakes, and perhaps already have. I asked for strength, not to appear strong, but to remain honest. I asked for courage, not to defeat enemies, but to resist becoming one of them. I asked for protection, not from danger, but from self-deception. I asked for Africa, for leaders who remember why they were chosen, for systems that reward integrity instead of loyalty, for people who refuse despair even when change is slow. I ask for Muslims and Christians, for believers and non-believers, to find common ground not in doctrine, but in dignity. Jesus did not answer with words. The light began to fade, not abruptly, but gently, like a day ending without drama. I felt my body again, the ache of exhaustion, the weight of responsibility returning. I woke with my heart beating fast. There was no voice in the room, no sign on the wall, no command carved into certainty. Only one question remained, echoing clearly within me. If I know what is right and still delay, how am I different from those who created this suffering? I share this not as a vision meant to elevate me, but as a reminder meant to humble me. I woke that morning still tired, still surrounded by problems that did not disappear because of a dream. Borders were still fragile, enemies were still armed, corruption had not evaporated. Children were still hungry, hospitals were still under strain. Nothing external had changed, but something internal had. I understood that leadership is not proven by how loudly one speaks of justice, but by how consistently one resists becoming comfortable with injustice. I understood that faith stripped of spectacle is not about certainty. It is about accountability. It is about allowing oneself to be questioned, even when one holds power. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, I say this: conscience is not owned by any single tradition. Justice does not belong to one language of prayer. When mercy is practiced sincerely, it becomes a bridge rather than a boundary. To my Christian brothers and sisters, especially those who love Jesus, not only for his miracles but for his moral courage, I say this: his hardest teachings were never about belief alone. They were about responsibility, about what we tolerate, about who we protect, about who we are willing to disappoint in order to remain faithful to truth. To the leaders of the Sahel and to leaders everywhere, I speak without accusation. Power does not demand perfection, it demands vigilance. The greatest danger we face is not failure. It is forgetting why we began. To those watching from afar, from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from places where Africa is often spoken about but rarely listened to, I ask only this: do not reduce our struggle to symbols or slogans. We are not a warning story. We are a human story. And our future, like yours, depends on daily choices made quietly far from cameras. I do not present myself as a model. I present myself as a man still choosing, still resisting the easy path, still learning that moral clarity often arrives without applause and sometimes without immediate results. I do not know what history will say about my leadership. That is not mine to decide. What I can decide is whether I will remain awake, whether I will allow delay to harden into habit, whether I will confuse survival with success. I pray for Africa, not that she become powerful, but that she become just, not that she dominate, but that she heal. Not that she impress the world, but that she remember her own worth. I pray for myself, not that I be protected from criticism, but that I be protected from self-deception. Not that I be remembered, but that I remain responsible. And I pray for you who are listening, wherever you are, whatever you believe, that you do not surrender your conscience to exhaustion or fear. The world does not change because of grand moments. It changes because ordinary people refuse to stop choosing what is right. If this reflection speaks to you, if it stirs something you have been holding quietly, I invite you to stay engaged, to listen again, to reflect, to share your thoughts with others who are also still choosing. Not to follow a person, but to walk alongside a conversation that values conscience over noise. Every day I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only awareness or surrender. And today, I choose awareness.